Would you trust a single private citizen to save the US financial system? In the Gilded Age, the government did, more than once. When Wall Street wobbled, when gold reserves were so low you could have fit them in a backpack, when banks teetered on collapse, one man simply shut the bronze doors of his private library, locked America's richest bankers inside, and refused to let them out until they agreed to his plan. That man was John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, financier, monopolist, art collector, and the grumpy face of American capitalism. He was so powerful he created the first billion-dollar corporation, so feared that newspapers drew him as a cartoon giant with a nose bigger than a battleship, and so contradictory that he could terrify industrial titans by day and quietly outbid everyone for a medieval Bible by night. Morgan's story is a strange mix. He started as the sternly raised son of a Hartford banker, dodged the Civil War draft by paying someone else to serve, yes, that was legal, and went on to build an empire out of railroads, steel, and electricity. Think Elon Musk with less tweeting, or Jeff Bezos if he'd preferred first editions to rocket ships. He loved order, hated cameras, and believed that rules were for other people. He had the uncanny ability to calm a financial panic with nothing more than his glare and a cigar, the Gilded Age equivalent of turning it off and on again. So tonight, we'll follow his rise, the scandals, the fortunes, the purple-veined nose, the art, the family, the bronze doors slammed shut in the face of chaos. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, this story is for you. And if you enjoy these journeys, tell me where you are in the world down in the comments, and please subscribe so you don't miss the next scandal-soaked bedtime story. John Pierpont Morgan. The name alone sounds heavy, like it should be carved into stone over a bank vault. But before he became the king of the Gilded Age, he was just Pierpont, a sickly, shy boy born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a stern, exacting man who ran his household like a branch office of the family business. Dinner conversation was less, "How was your day?" and more, "What is the rate of exchange in London?" Junius believed that children, like balance sheets, should be audited daily. Pierpont grew up in a house where punctuality was sacred, silence was golden, and frivolity was filed under unnecessary expenditure. And yet, young Pierpont wasn't the picture of budding strength. He suffered from seizures, rheumatic fever, and bouts of ill health that kept him indoors. Other boys his age were out roughhousing, scraping knees, and playing stickball. Pierpont was often in bed, sweating under wool blankets while doctors muttered about his constitution. His mother Mary babied him, while Junius demanded stoicism. This tug-of-war between mollycoddling and military discipline shaped him into a strange mixture, sensitive in private, granite in public. His father Junius despised weakness. Get up, endure, control yourself, was essentially his parenting philosophy. His mother, Mary, was the opposite, fussing, tucking blankets, and shooing away drafts. The result was a young man who learned two contradictory lessons at once: that tenderness existed, but that he must never show it in public. Imagine being a kid with recurring fevers in a world with no antibiotics. Pierpont spent months indoors reading, sketching, and memorizing figures. It was boring, yes, but boredom can be a fertile teacher. He discovered patience, self-control, and an almost obsessive love of order. Chaos outside, discipline inside. It became his lifelong coping strategy. He also became deeply private. Being sick meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous in a world where even your own father might scorn you for it. That early training explains the grown man's hatred of photographs, his curt answers to strangers, and his preference for the company of ledgers over people. If you've ever been in a group chat and preferred just muting it rather than jumping into the mess, you get Pierpont's temperament. Even as a young adult, he looked older than his years. Portraits of him in his 20s show a man with a stern brow, already practicing the look that could stop conversations. His nose, which later bloomed into its famous purple condition, was beginning to dominate his features. He seemed, in short, like a man who skipped adolescence entirely and went straight from sickly boy to grumpy uncle. But here's the irony. That fragile body carried one of the strongest wills of the century. Where his body failed him, his mind compensated. And that iron discipline, forged in childhood weakness, became the foundation for his role as the man who could stare down a financial panic and win. Education was serious business. At the Hartford Public School, and later at Boston English High School, Pierpont excelled in mathematics. Numbers, unlike people, behaved predictably. 2 plus 2 never sneered at you across a ballroom. From Boston, he went abroad to study in Switzerland and Germany, a sort of financial finishing school. At the University of Göttingen, he polished his German, read Goethe, and according to classmates, carried himself with the stiff dignity of someone already practicing to be intimidating at dinner parties. But the real education was at home. Junius drilled into him the family motto, character before money. A noble-sounding creed, though later critics would argue the Morgans often pursued both with equal ferocity. Still, the phrase stuck. To Pierpont, character meant discipline, secrecy, and control. Picture it. A young man, tall, pale, with a nose already leaning toward its famous purple bloom, scribbling figures in a notebook while classmates went out drinking. If you've ever been the one person in a group project actually doing the work while everyone else played beer pong, you have an idea of Pierpont's youth. By the time he returned to America in his early 20s, he was armed with languages, arithmetic, and an iron sense of duty. Junius set him on the path of banking, where Pierpont's life would stop being about health and start being about power. Pierpont's first taste of banking came in 1857, when he joined the New York firm Duncan Sherman and Company, the American agents for his father's London firm. His timing was impeccable, or terrible, depending on how you see it. That very year, the panic of 1857 struck. Banks collapsed, credit evaporated, and young clerks watched seasoned financiers turn paler than their starched collars. Pierpont, still in his 20s, saw chaos firsthand. The experience seared into him a lifelong obsession with order. In his mind, financial panic wasn't a storm you weathered. It was a room you locked, preferably with you inside, barking orders until everyone calmed down. Of course, not all his early ventures were so noble. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, Pierpont was involved in what became known as the Hall Carbine Affair. He and some partners bought thousands of defective rifles from the US Army for a bargain price, had them tinkered with, and then sold them back to the Army at a hefty profit. The rifles jammed and sometimes blew up in soldiers' faces. The scandal made headlines. Critics accused him of profiteering off patriotism. Morgan shrugged it off. To him, it was just a business deal. Buy low, sell high, stay alive. Then came the draft of 1863. The Union needed men, but Pierpont decided he wasn't going to be one of them. Instead, he exercised a perfectly legal option. He paid a substitute $300 to fight in his place. That's about $6,000 today. It was common among the wealthy, but it left a bitter taste among ordinary soldiers who didn't have a spare $300 lying around. Morgan was branded a shirk in some quarters. His reputation as aloof, privileged, and detached from the common man only deepened. But while others gossiped, Pierpont worked. By the late 1860s, he was known as a solid, reliable banker, with a gift for numbers and an even greater gift for intimidation. His colleagues noticed that while he rarely raised his voice, his glare could silence a room. Imagine being scolded by a teacher who doesn't shout but simply stares until you melt into your chair. That was Pierpont, even in his 20s. Still, he was learning the ropes, building his reputation, and waiting for the moment he could truly shape the financial world. The late 1860s were a kind of dress rehearsal for the empire J.P. Morgan would later command. He was not yet the man who could slam bronze doors and order America's bankers into line, but you could already see the outline. Like a young actor practicing his scowl in the mirror before stepping onto the stage, Pierpont was fine-tuning the tools he would use for the rest of his career. One of his earliest lessons came from railroads. The 1860s were the Wild West of American industry. Everyone wanted a piece of the action, and railroads sprawled across the country like spaghetti tossed onto a map. Too many lines overlapped, undercutting each other with chaotic schedules and inconsistent rates. To most investors, it looked like noise. To Morgan, it looked like an opportunity. He studied balance sheets and timetables the way a detective studies footprints. He wasn't big enough yet to take control of entire companies, but he learned how to pick apart inefficiencies and back the winners. He also dabbled in financing shipping, helping secure vessels and cargo loans. Ships may not sound glamorous compared to railroads and steel, but for Pierpont, it was another laboratory for order. If you could standardize contracts, enforce schedules, and get paid on time, you had leverage. He loved leverage. Socially, these years were important too. He was slowly building a reputation as the man who never wasted words. Other financiers might boast about their deals in cigar-smoked rooms, but Morgan sat quietly, glaring from behind a haze of cigar smoke. The silence did half the work. People left meetings with him rattled, sometimes agreeing to terms simply to escape the weight of his stare. If you've ever clicked accept cookies on a website just to make the pop-up go away, you understand the dynamic. At the same time, he developed a taste for orderly leisure. Morgan began sailing more frequently, discovering a passion for yachts that would stay with him all his life. On board, he controlled everything: the menu, the schedule, the route. Guests joked that stepping onto one of his vessels was less like a vacation and more like a financial boot camp with better food. But it was also a way for him to test what he loved most: absolute authority in a confined space. His social circle was expanding. By the late 1860s, Pierpont was moving among the kind of people who would matter later: bankers, railroad executives, and wealthy families in New York. He wasn't quite accepted by the Knickerbocker elite, but he didn't need to be. They might sneer at his lack of pedigree, but they couldn't sneer at the numbers he delivered. And in the end, Pierpont Morgan always bet on numbers. Looking back, you could say this was the decade when he learned that intimidation and efficiency were marketable commodities. He didn't yet have the power to bend industries to his will, but he knew what it felt like to bend people. A secretary once recalled that when Pierpont fixed his eyes on you, it felt like your excuses evaporated. That was the embryonic form of the man who would later make Carnegie sell his steel empire in a single afternoon. By the end of the 1860s, Pierpont Morgan wasn't yet the king of the Gilded Age, but the crown was in sight. He had learned how to exploit chaos, project authority, and keep his ambitions disguised under a calm, cigar-smoked exterior. The boy with rheumatic fever had become the banker with nerves of steel, and his first real conquests were just around the corner. By the mid-1860s, Pierpont Morgan had survived scandal, ducked military service, and made his first mark in banking. But in the Gilded Age, being powerful on paper wasn't enough. You needed the right wife, the right house, and the right guest list. Appearances weren't window dressing. They were collateral. His first marriage, to Amelia Sturgis in 1861, had ended in tragedy just 4 months later. She died of tuberculosis at 19, leaving Pierpont gutted. He rarely spoke of her again, as if grief could be filed in a locked drawer. But friends noticed he became even more private afterward, sealing off his feelings with the same discipline he used on his ledgers. In 1865, he married Frances Louisa Tracy, known as Fanny, the daughter of a respected New York lawyer. Fanny wasn't flashy, but she brought stability. Together they had 4 children, including John Pierpont Jack Morgan Jr., who would later inherit the business. Their Madison Avenue home ran on strict order: meals at precise hours, servants in quiet efficiency, silver trays polished until you could check your hair in them. Visitors recalled the atmosphere as dignified but stiff. The Morgans weren't the family that threw open doors for spontaneous laughter or surprise piano recital. It was more like living inside a perpetual Sunday afternoon, where the children were expected to be miniature adults and the adults kept conversation firmly on respectable topics. Still, Pierpont cultivated an image of solid respectability. He wanted to be the banker you trusted with your fortune, even if you secretly didn't like him very much. Think of him as the financial version of that boss who terrifies everyone, but still gets promoted because, annoyingly, he delivers results. But behind the domestic facade, Pierpont was developing two passions that revealed much about his character: architecture and music. He once quipped that architecture is only a balance sheet made visible. To him, buildings weren't just stone and marble. They were statements of order, discipline, and permanence. No surprise that later he would pour his fortune into his own library, designed like a temple of silence. Music, too, was less about joy than about control. He loved the opera, not because he was humming arias at breakfast, but because opera was society's scoreboard. Who had a box? Who got the best seats? Who was invited backstage? It was financial statements performed in costumes. Pierpont threw his weight behind the Metropolitan Opera in the 1880s, siding against the snooty, old-money Academy of Music, which refused to expand its limited boxes for new families like the Vanderbilts. Morgan's move wasn't just about taste, it was about reshaping social capital. By the late 1870s, his reputation was crystallizing: a banker with nerves of steel, a family man with an iron sense of order, and a cultural patron who wielded his influence like a ledger book. Physically, he was becoming infamous too. His nose, inflamed by a skin condition, turned purplish and bulbous, an easy target for cartoonists. He loathed being photographed, often lunging at cameras with his cane. When you're one of the richest men in America and your greatest enemy is Kodak, you know you're complicated. But caricatures aside, Morgan was stepping into the role he was born for, not just a banker, but a system builder. The stage was set for him to impose his personal love of order onto the sprawling chaos of American industry. While the Vanderbilt staged costume balls where guests dressed as electric light bulbs, Morgan loathed parties. He preferred dinners that lasted less than an hour, his ideal evening. Guests seated promptly, soup ladled quickly, main course consumed without chatter, cigars lit by the 40-minute mark, and everyone politely ushered to the door. Small talk was torture to him. Ask about the weather, and you might get a grunt. Ask about a balance sheet, and you'd get a monologue. If you've ever been at a work happy hour where one colleague keeps talking about quarterly reports while everyone else just wants nachos, you've basically met Morgan. He wasn't hostile to people exactly. He just had no patience for the wasted time of society rituals. He invested his social capital in the opera, where seats mattered more than conversation, and in his library, where manuscripts didn't talk back. Yet despite his dislike for chatter, people still clamored for invitations. Because even if your dinner ended in record time, you got to say you had dinner with J.P. Morgan. And in the Gilded Age, that was priceless. Morgan's true nemesis wasn't Rockefeller, Carnegie, or even Teddy Roosevelt. It was photographers. He despised being photographed and once smashed a camera with his cane. His bulbous, rosacea-stricken nose became a cartoonist's dream. Harper's Weekly drew him as a giant octopus with tentacles gripping railroads. Puck magazine portrayed him with his nose the size of an airship. Morgan hated it. He once barked at a reporter, "If you publish that, I'll kill you." Everyone laughed nervously, but no one was entirely sure he was joking. His hatred of the press only made him more mysterious. Ordinary Americans rarely saw him, and when they did, he looked like an irritated walrus in a silk waistcoat. The secrecy fueled the legend. Who was this man behind the smoke and scowl who could topple industries with a glance? Morgan's contempt for publicity wasn't arrogance alone. To him, attention meant chaos. Better to keep the world at arm's length. He wanted his deals quiet, his dinners short, and his face nowhere near a newspaper sketch. Which, of course, guaranteed the opposite. His face was everywhere. If the 1860s and 70s were rehearsal, the 1880s and 90s were the performance. America's economy was exploding. Railroads, steel, oil, and electricity all barreled forward with little regulation and plenty of chaos. Companies rose and fell overnight. Millionaires appeared as quickly as mushrooms after rainstorms. Most people saw madness. Morgan saw spreadsheets waiting to be tidied. He earned the title the organizer of capital because that's exactly what he did. He took industries that looked like a food fight and forced them into a table-mannered dinner. Railroads were his first big target. By the 1880s, they were in financial freefall. Too many lines, too much competition, constant bankruptcies. Morgan stepped in, merging failing lines, cutting duplicate routes, and imposing schedules. Investors grumbled, but profits steadied. Passengers might still be late, but the ledgers should be balanced. In 1892, he turned to electricity, orchestrating the merger that created General Electric. It was the industrial equivalent of taking two bickering roommates and forcing them into marriage counseling. Under Morgan's glare, rivals Edison General Electric and Thomson Houston merged, and suddenly America had a corporate giant. His boldest stroke came in 1901. Andrew Carnegie, King of Steel, was ready to retire. Carnegie famously scribbled his asking price on a slip of paper and handed it to one of Morgan's partners. The figure, $480 million. That's about $17 billion today. Morgan barely blinked. "Congratulate me," he reportedly said after closing the deal. "I am now the owner of the United States Steel Company." U.S. Steel became the first billion-dollar corporation in history. $1 billion. An amount so colossal that it was practically science fiction at the time. The company controlled 2/3 of America's steel production. Morgan hadn't invented steel, but he had invented industrial consolidation at a scale the world had never seen. His methods were ruthless. He favored monopolies, distrusted competition, and believed industries should be run by a handful of competent men, preferably ones who answered to him. If capitalism is usually imagined as a free-for-all, Morgan saw it as a boardroom with one chair at the head of the table. His chair. Critics called him a tyrant. Admirers called him a savior. Cartoonists drew him as a giant octopus strangling railroads and factories with his tentacles. But whatever the perspective, no one doubted his dominance. If Rockefeller was the king of oil and Carnegie the king of steel, Morgan was the king of kings, the man who organized the industrial barons into an empire. J.P. Morgan's true kingdom wasn't Wall Street or his marble library. It was the deck of his yacht. Actually, yachts, plural. He owned several across his life, and all of them were named Corsair, because when you have enough money, you don't need creativity, you just need consistency. The Corsair wasn't just a pleasure boat, it was a floating throne room. Guests were carefully chosen, politicians, bankers, aristocrats, artists, and once you stepped aboard, you surrendered to Morgan's regime. Meals were served when he said so. The menu was whatever he decided. If he felt like Shakespeare readings on deck, Shakespeare it was. If he wanted silence, the Atlantic suddenly became the quietest ocean on earth. People joked that being invited on the Corsair was both an honor and a sentence. Imagine expecting cocktails and sea breezes, and instead finding yourself living under maritime dictatorship with cigars as the only civil liberty. But the lure was irresistible. An invitation to the Corsair meant you were in Morgan's orbit, which, in business and society, could be worth more than money. At sea, Morgan relaxed in his own stern way. He played solitaire, smoked cigars, and read. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't entirely forbidding either. The yacht gave him something the office couldn't: space, order, and control over the horizon itself. If Wall Street was chaos, the Corsair was his floating spreadsheet, perfectly balanced, moving only when he willed it. Morgan was a man of habits and obsessions. He smoked endlessly, once saying cigars calmed him enough to deal with fools. He collected gemstones, so much so that a rare pink beryl was named after him, Morganite. He barked at clerks who used 2 paperclips instead of 1, demanding efficiency down to the smallest detail. He had a booming voice and a terrifying glare, but also a love for kittens, which occasionally roamed his library. He once interrupted a meeting to pet one. His contradictions made him hard to categorize. Ruthless monopolist in the boardroom, doting cat owner at home. For your bedtime listener, these quirks make him feel human, almost eccentric, a titan of finance, undone by a wriggling kitten batting at his ledger. For all his power, Morgan craved something more than railroads and steel. He wanted permanence. Money could be lost in a panic, companies could collapse, but art could last. So he began collecting. And not modestly. Manuscripts, paintings, rare books, antiquities. If it had history and beauty, Morgan wanted it. His private library on Madison Avenue became his sanctuary. Designed with heavy stone, marble interiors, and stained glass, it was less a library than a cathedral to order. Guests whispered when they entered, as if afraid to offend the manuscripts. The true secret weapon of the Morgan Library was Belle de Costa Green, his personal librarian. Belle was brilliant, witty, and fearless at auction. She had a gift for driving up bids with a raised eyebrow and then snatching treasures at the perfect moment. Rumours swirled about her closeness to Morgan. She was his confidant, maybe more. What made their partnership all the more remarkable was Belle's hidden identity. She was a black woman passing as white in a society that would have barred her otherwise. Few knew the truth during her lifetime, but her role was pivotal. Under Morgan's eye and Belle's brilliance, the library filled with treasures, Gutenberg Bibles, medieval illuminated manuscripts, drawings by Michelangelo. Morgan once spent $100,000 on a single manuscript, the kind of money that could have built an entire block of tenements. Critics sneered, but Morgan didn't care. "If you have to ask the price," he once said, "you can't afford it." His collecting wasn't entirely selfish. He lent works to museums, supported institutions, and left much of his collection to the public after his death. But it also soothed his restless need for control. In business, markets fluctuated. In art, beauty could be acquired, catalogued, and placed under glass. Think of it this way. During the day, he corralled railroads and bankers. At night, he corralled Michelangelo's sketches and medieval psalters. Both gave him the same thrill. Chaos transformed into order, forever. For all his power, Morgan's body never fully cooperated. He suffered migraines so severe they sent him to darkened rooms. His skin condition left his nose swollen and purple, a permanent caricature. He puffed cigars endlessly, sometimes 20 a day, which hardly helped. Doctors prescribed exotic cures. He tried European spas, sulfur baths, even newfangled electrical therapies where current was applied to the skin. Imagine the most powerful man in America lying in a hotel robe while a German doctor buzzed his face with a contraption that looked like a toaster. Morgan endured it all with the same grim patience he brought to banking. His health struggles made him irritable, but also oddly relatable. For all his billions, he still reached for hot compresses and strange tonics, proof that money can't cure everything. His illnesses also explain his love of art and books, pursuits that required no running, no sweating, no exertion, just silence and focus. In the end, his body was fragile, but his will was iron. And that tension, the sickly boy who became the unshakable banker, defined him. By the early 1890s, J.P. Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was becoming something more unsettling, the referee of American capitalism. Railroads, steel, electricity. He had either consolidated them or had a hand in stabilizing them. But what fascinated observers was the way he began to act less like a private financier and more like a statesman without ever running for office. America didn't vote for him, but increasingly, it needed him. Take the railroads. By the 1890s, nearly every line of track east of the Mississippi had felt Morgan's hand. Executives who resisted his reorganizations often discovered that creditors suddenly found them untrustworthy. Miraculously, those same creditors became flexible once Morgan blessed a merger. It was less about brute force and more about aura. If Morgan said a company was sound, investors nodded. If he said it was doomed, the stock market quietly agreed. Business leaders started treating him like a secular pope of finance. They trekked to his offices on Wall Street, rooms deliberately designed to feel austere, almost priestly. No gilded chairs or velvet curtains, just plain desks, green-shaded lamps. And Morgan himself, glowering behind a cloud of cigar smoke. Visitors said it felt like a confessional. Only instead of confessing sins, you confessed your balance sheet. And then, there was his influence on politics. Officially, Morgan never sought office. He disliked speeches and distrusted voters. But when the Treasury needed gold, it was Morgan's phone that rang. When companies clashed, it was Morgan who mediated. He had become a living paradox. A private man whose private decisions dictated the fate of a very public nation. By this point, the public had started to notice and to worry. Cartoonists drew him as a giant octopus strangling industry, or as a rotund emperor sitting on a pile of railroads. Ordinary Americans didn't love the idea that their livelihoods depended on a single man's glare, but whether they liked it or not, the next 2 decades would prove just how essential and terrifying Morgan's dominance could be. It was in this context, the 1890s, with America's economy teetering, that Morgan's most famous crises arrived, and the bronze doors of his library would slam shut on a trembling Wall Street. The first test came in 1895, when the U.S. Treasury's gold reserves were dwindling. America was on the gold standard, and confidence in the dollar depended on having enough of the shiny stuff locked away. But after a financial panic and heavy withdrawals, the Treasury's reserves sank below $100 million, a psychological breaking point. President Grover Cleveland's government panicked. If confidence collapsed, the dollar would plummet, trade would freeze, and the economy might spiral into depression. The solution? Call J.P. Morgan. Morgan arranged a deal with the Treasury. He and a syndicate of bankers would supply $65 million in gold in exchange for government bonds. It was part patriotism, part profit, and entirely audacious. A private banker was saving the US government with a single transaction. Critics fumed that America had become a client of Morgan & Co. Supporters pointed out that without him, the dollar might have collapsed. But the true theatre came a decade later, in 1907. That year, a panic swept through Wall Street after a failed attempt to corner the copper market. Banks wobbled, depositors rushed to withdraw funds, and trust companies collapsed. The New York Stock Exchange itself hovered on the brink of shutting down. Into this chaos stepped Morgan, by then nearly 70 years old. He summoned the nation's leading bankers and locked them inside his private library on Madison Avenue. The bronze doors shut, and Morgan told them they weren't leaving until they found a solution. Hours dragged on. Men sweated, argued, and fumed. Morgan paced, smoking cigar after cigar, occasionally barking a command. Finally, near dawn, they emerged with a plan. Banks would pool resources to support the stock exchange, and the panic would be contained. Newspapers described Morgan as a general commanding troops or as a medieval king holding court. Some praised him as a savior. Others grumbled that it was outrageous for one private citizen to wield such power. But whatever your view, the fact remained. He had done what the government could not. He had stopped a financial panic with nothing more than stubborn will and a room full of terrified bankers. Today, we talk about bailouts, the Federal Reserve, and stimulus packages. Back then, America had none of those. It had J.P. Morgan, a library, and a very heavy set of bronze doors. Morgan loathed politics. He thought speeches were a waste of breath and voters a nuisance, but presidents had to deal with him, because when the economy tottered, Morgan was the one who steadied it. He famously clashed with Theodore Roosevelt. When Roosevelt launched antitrust suits, Morgan marched into the White House, unannounced, and demanded to see him. "If we've done anything wrong," Morgan growled, "send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt, barely hiding his fury, replied, "That's not how the law works." It was the perfect illustration of their worldviews. Roosevelt believed in democratic process. Morgan believed in private negotiation. Other presidents leaned on him more directly. Cleveland needed his gold. Taft grumbled about his monopolies. Wilson's administration eventually broke his system apart with the Federal Reserve. But in every case, Morgan treated presidents as if they were mildly irritating junior partners in his firm. It was both audacious and true. For decades, Morgan had more immediate power over the nation's finances than any elected official. By the 1910s, Morgan's dominance was so complete that critics sharpened their knives. In 1912, he was called before the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into the money trust. Lawmakers accused him of controlling too much: banks, railroads, industries, all under his thumb. Morgan, looming in the witness chair with his bulbous nose and growling voice, gave his most famous reply: "A man I do not trust could not borrow from me on all the security in Christendom." To Morgan, it was simple. Trust and character mattered more than collateral. To critics, it was terrifying. The nation's financial system was based on one man's personal judgment. That same year, scandal struck from another direction: the Titanic disaster. Morgan had helped finance the International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line, the line that operated the Titanic. He was supposed to be on the ship's maiden voyage in April 1912, but cancelled at the last moment. When the Titanic sank, killing more than 1,500 passengers, conspiracy theories bloomed. Some claimed Morgan avoided the disaster on purpose, though the truth was more mundane. He stayed in France to tend to his health and art collection. Still, the Titanic tarnished his reputation. It symbolized everything critics hated about the Gilded Age: luxury for the few, disaster for the many. And Morgan, conveniently absent, became an easy target. By then, his health was failing. He was in his mid-70s, plagued by headaches, rosacea, and exhaustion. His purple nose, mocked endlessly by cartoonists, was just one outward sign of a body breaking down. But he continued working, shuttling between Europe and America, still glowering over balance sheets and art auctions. Even as he aged, Morgan remained the paradox he had always been: feared and courted, mocked and indispensable, vulgar and refined. In March 1913, J.P. Morgan died in Rome at the age of 75. The news reverberated instantly around the world. His fortune was estimated at around $70 million, far less than Rockefeller's hundreds of millions. For a man who had commanded empires, some were surprised at the number. But Morgan had never been about cash piles. His wealth was in influence, in the ability to dictate terms to presidents, kings, and captains of industry. His funeral at St. George's Episcopal Church in New York was dignified, orderly, and understated, very Morgan. Among the mourners were financiers, politicians, and industrialists who had once trembled under his glare. President Woodrow Wilson sent condolences, though he was already pushing reforms to limit the kind of power Morgan had wielded. His legacy lived on in multiple forms. His son, Jack Morgan, took over the firm. Belle de Costa Green continued running the library, preserving his art and manuscripts. And just months after his death, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a central bank, essentially replacing Morgan's private authority with a public institution. America decided it could no longer rely on one man to slam bronze doors when panic struck. The Morgan Library, open to the public, became his most enduring monument, a temple of books, manuscripts, and silence that outlasted the bluster of railroads and steel. Visitors still walk through its marble halls today, whispering as if the old banker himself might appear from behind a tapestry and glare at them for talking too loudly. In the end, J.P. Morgan was both a symbol of the Gilded Age's excess and its stability. He was the man who embodied its paradox, the ruthless monopolist who also saved the system, the collector of beauty who terrified entire markets, the king without a crown who ruled with nothing but his character, and of course, that famous glare. After Morgan's death in 1913, his children carried his name like a weight. Jack Morgan, his son, took over the firm, but lacked his father's terrifying presence. Where Pierpont glared, Jack negotiated. Where Pierpont dominated, Jack compromised. It kept the business alive, but diluted the myth. His daughters lived quieter lives, marrying into prominent families but always under the shadow of their father's glower. Bell de Costa Green, his librarian, arguably carried his legacy more vividly than his heirs, shaping the Morgan Library into a cultural treasure. For a man obsessed with order, the chaos of family was something he could never fully master. In the end, his truest child was the institution, the bank that bore his name, the library that kept his manuscripts, the legend that still intimidates. And that's where we'll leave him. Not on a trading floor, but in a quiet room. The lamps low, the velvet ropes still, the manuscripts breathing their paper and ink hush. J.P. Morgan began as a sickly boy taught to fear disorder. He ended as the man who convinced an entire country that order could be made, on a ledger, on a railroad map, behind a set of bronze doors. He wasn't charming, he wasn't gentle, but he was, relentlessly, effective. He took a century that sounded like cutlery in a garbage disposal and turned the noise into something like a march. Railroads stopped tripping over themselves. Steel learned to behave. Even panics, those financial house fires, found themselves confronted by a large, impatient man who basically did the Gilded Age version of turn it off and on again. And somehow, it worked. The contradictions are the whole point. He could terrify a room full of bankers and then spend a fortune on a single page of medieval script. He could build the first billion-dollar corporation and still be felled by headaches, hot compresses, and a face doctors tried to fix with buzzing machines. He could hate attention and become a national caricature. He could dislike politics and still act like a backup branch of government when the real one hesitated. After he died, the United States created the Federal Reserve, an institution so we wouldn't need a single private citizen to slam doors and save Wall Street again. His power became a policy. His glare became a committee. The man turned into a system, and the system, for better or worse, kept going. If you ever visit his library, you'll feel it. The hush, the marble, the certainty that everything has a place. In your mind's ear, you can still hear the clack of a cane, the rustle of a ledger, the muttered no that meant fix it. Out on the water, you can almost see the Corsair cutting a clean line through the chop. Everyone aboard suddenly remembering that the schedule is the schedule and dessert is not a debate. And that's our story tonight. A life made of rules and exceptions, of art and arithmetic, of wealth that bought order and scandals that came free with it. If you're listening with eyelids heavy and a brain that won't quite power down, let the last image be simple. A librarian's footfall on stone, a door closing softly, and a big, complicated century agreeing, just this once, to be quiet. If you enjoyed this one, tell me where you're listening from in the world, and please subscribe so you don't miss the next scandal-soaked bedtime story from the Gilded Age. Sleep well.